It was the kind of marriage people envied. To the outside world, James and Lillian Monroe were picture-perfect. They lived in a well-kept two-story colonial home on Maplewood Lane, nestled in the heart of suburban Missouri. James ran a successful auto repair shop, Monroe's Motorworks, and was known for his honest prices and no-nonsense attitude. Lillian worked part-time at the local public library, often organizing children's reading programs and volunteering at the food pantry. She was soft-spoken, polite, and kept a flower garden that neighbors said bloomed like a Monet painting. They had no children, but they had each other. And for 15 years, that seemed to be enough. The Monroes were regulars at the local Sunday church service, always seated in the third pew from the front. Lillian would bring homemade banana bread to bake sales. James helped install Christmas lights for elderly neighbors each December. When they walked through the community fair holding hands, people saw stability, devotion, love. Their home reflected the same. Family photos lined the hallway, vacations in Yellowstone, a trip to Niagara Falls, anniversaries celebrated over candlelit dinners. There were framed prints with words like faith, hope, and love on the walls, and a little wooden sign above the fireplace that read, "Grow old with me." To friends, James often joked about how Lillian rescued him from his wild 20s. After he left the Navy, he'd wandered, emotionally adrift after the death of his mother. He met Lillian at a bus stop in St. Louis during a particularly cold winter. She offered him a hand warmer and a smile. That small gesture, he said, turned into coffee, then dates, then marriage. They eloped in a civil ceremony 3 months later. No grand wedding, no big announcements. Just the two of them. It was quiet, sudden, but James always said, "When you know, you know." And yet, for all the comfort and routine, there were whispers. Nothing dramatic, just small murmurs. Lillian was elusive when it came to her past. She never mentioned her family. When asked about her childhood, she'd simply say she moved around a lot. There were no photos of her before her 30s, no relatives visiting during the holidays, and no old friends showing up from her hometown, wherever that was. When neighbors asked where she was from originally, she'd smile and say, "Everywhere and nowhere." It didn't raise much suspicion at the time. People assumed she had a painful past, perhaps trauma she didn't want to talk about. In fact, it made her seem even more graceful, like someone who rose from hardship to create a beautiful life. James defended her privacy fiercely. "Not everyone's past is pretty," he once told his friend Tom from the bar. "What matters is now." But even James, in the quiet corners of his mind, sometimes wondered. They had never gone to the hospital together. Lillian had a particular aversion to doctors. When James was diagnosed with gallstones, she barely accompanied him for tests. She said hospitals gave her anxiety. Even when he suggested she go for a routine physical, she waved it off with a smile. "I know my body better than any doctor," she'd say. She never talked about children. James, who'd once imagined a daughter with Lillian's eyes and his laugh, gave up trying after a few years. She told him she had health issues that would make pregnancy risky. He accepted that, never pressed. They didn't argue. They didn't fight. But they didn't talk deeply either. Not about the past, not about fears, not about dreams. Their marriage was made of smiles, dinners, and habit. It was more companionship than passion. But after 15 years, James thought that was normal. Until it wasn't. The cracks in their storybook life would begin to show slowly, like water seeping through a ceiling after a hidden pipe has burst. And when the truth came out, it would explode, not like a betrayal, but like a detonation. A 15-year marriage, picture-perfect home, a life built on trust, and one devastating secret buried beneath it all. For the first 10 years of their marriage, James Monroe never opened the safe in the upstairs closet. It wasn't because it was off-limits, Lillian never said that, but it was always hers. She kept her important documents in there, she said. Old journals, sentimental things. He didn't pry. They had mutual respect, and he trusted her. Still, there were times James found himself staring at it longer than he should have. It was a medium-sized steel safe with a basic key lock. He never saw her open it. Never saw what was inside. In fact, he never even saw her with a key. That safe, silent, gray, and unmoving, would become a symbol of everything James didn't know about his wife. Lillian didn't like talking about her childhood, and in the early days of their relationship, James respected that. Everyone had skeletons, he thought. His father had been abusive. His own teenage years were littered with anger, bar fights, and unpaid debts. He didn't need to relive that, and he didn't expect her to either. But there were moments, like when she flinched at certain questions, or when they watched an old family-themed movie, and she'd excuse herself to the kitchen, claiming the dishes needed doing, even when the sink was empty. "Where did you grow up again?" he asked once, early in their marriage. She smiled, like she always did when avoiding an answer. "Ohio, sort of. We moved a lot. Foster homes. That kind of thing." He never asked again. Over the years, James began to notice something odd. There was no trail. No high school yearbooks. No college photos. No baby pictures. Not even a wedding album, though that one, he admitted, was partly his fault. They'd eloped in a courthouse and never had a formal ceremony. But there were no phone calls from old friends. No cousins visiting for the holidays. No funerals to attend. No reunions. No social media presence, either. James once jokingly told her, "If you ever go missing, there wouldn't be a single lead for the cops to chase." She laughed nervously. "Guess I'm off the grid." He laughed too. But deep down, something didn't feel right. One summer, James developed a skin condition that needed treatment. He visited a dermatologist, and after seeing his recovery, he casually mentioned to Lillian, "You should get your annual checkup too, you know?" Her face stiffened. "I don't need one," he chuckled. "Come on, Lil. Everyone needs one. You don't even have a doctor on file at our clinic." "I said I'm fine." James backed off, but something shifted that day. He couldn't understand why a woman in her 40s wouldn't want basic health checkups. She refused mammograms, avoided gynecologists. Even when he brought up health insurance benefits, she dismissed it. She told him she was just private. But the more private she became, the more James's unease grew. There was also a small wooden drawer in her writing desk that she always kept locked. James once tried to open it out of curiosity when she was out grocery shopping. The lock didn't budge. Inside, he heard papers rustle when he nudged it. Maybe documents, letters, something. When she returned and saw him near the desk, her voice was sharp, colder than he had ever heard it. "Looking for something?" "No, just thought I'd grab the scissors. They're in the kitchen." She didn't raise her voice, but her eyes didn't blink. That night, they ate in silence. For the first time in years. For a long time, James convinced himself that every marriage had mysteries. Not all spouses shared everything. Maybe she had trauma. Maybe her past was too painful to unpack. Maybe she didn't trust him enough. But deep inside, a seed of doubt had already been planted. It grew quietly. He started paying more attention to her body, to her reactions, to how she changed clothes always behind closed doors. She'd never undress in front of him fully. They never bathed together. Even their intimacy was limited to certain conditions. Darkness, brief moments, very controlled. He wondered, late at night, if this was what normal felt like. And then, during a routine dinner with an old Navy buddy, that seed of doubt bloomed into a suspicion he couldn't shake. It was a crisp autumn evening in late September when James attended his 25-year high school reunion in St. Louis. He hadn't originally planned on going. Reunions weren't really his thing. But Lillian had encouraged him. "You deserve a night out," she said, placing her hand gently on his shoulder. "Go, laugh, reminisce. Let the past visit you for once." James smiled at the irony. He'd always wanted to visit her past, but she kept the doors firmly shut. Still, he appreciated her support. He kissed her cheek, put on his old leather jacket, and drove off with the same classic rock CD playing that he'd loved in his teens. He had no idea that by the end of that night, the seeds of his entire world's unraveling would be planted. The gymnasium of East River High had been decorated with blue and white streamers, fairy lights, and a photo booth with props that mimicked their graduation year, 1998. The familiar smell of floor wax and nachos filled the air. Classmates hugged, laughed, and swapped stories of kids, divorces, and job changes. Some had aged gracefully. Others looked completely unrecognizable. James found himself chatting with his old football teammates, sipping on punch spiked with cheap rum, feeling almost 20 again. And then he saw Rick Deacon. Rick had been the class clown turned investigative journalist. He'd worked with a regional news outlet for years, digging up corruption cases and exposing hidden identities. James always liked him, sharp guy, good instincts, curious to a fault. James freakin' Monroe, Rick shouted across the room. Still got that killer mustache, or did age finally humble you? The two laughed and hugged like old times. As they caught up, Rick mentioned a project he'd been working on, an exposé about the legal gap in identity transitions across international borders. He was particularly focused on people who had traveled abroad for gender reassignment surgeries in the early 2000s, when U.S. laws weren't clear on medical documentation, and many transitioned without a legal paper trail. James barely listened. He was 3 cups of rum punch in and not particularly interested in journalism, until Rick pulled out his phone. Man, you'd be surprised how many people just vanished from their old lives and started over, Rick said, scrolling. Like this one here, this one's wild. He turned the phone toward James. Check this out. I've been trying to track this individual down for months. I think they changed names and disappeared. Probably went stealth full-time. It was a blurry image from a protest march in Chicago. Probably 20 years old. A tall figure, slim, wearing oversized sunglasses and a wide sun hat. The sign they held read, "Trans rights are human rights." At first glance, James wasn't sure what he was looking at. But then his stomach clenched. The jawline, the cheekbones, the stance. It looked exactly like Lillian. Not vaguely, not sort of, but unmistakably her face, just younger. Maybe early 20s. What's her name? James asked, trying to sound casual, but his voice betrayed him. Rick raised an eyebrow. That's the thing. I don't know her new name. That's what I'm trying to find out. Originally, Leonard Monroe, from Illinois, disappeared in 2007. Went to Thailand in 2006. No one's heard from him since. Family reported him missing. No trace. I think he transitioned overseas and never came back. The room around James blurred. The music, the chatter, the laughter, all faded to a hum in the background. Monroe. Leonard Monroe. He forced a grin. Crazy world, huh? Rick nodded. Sure is. James excused himself, said he needed air, and walked out into the cold night. He stood in the parking lot under a flickering lamppost, breathing heavily, heart pounding like a war drum in his chest. Leonard Monroe. Lillian Monroe. Same last name. Same face. Same person. James barely remembered the drive home. His mind was racing. Pieces of the puzzle, long ignored, started clicking into place with disturbing clarity. The safe, the medical secrecy, the aversion to intimacy, the lack of childhood photos, the unexplained past. He arrived home to find Lillian reading on the couch, a blanket tucked around her legs, the soft glow of a lamp illuminating her delicate features. She looked up and smiled. You're back early. James stared at her for a long moment, as if seeing her for the first time. Yeah, he said quietly. Just got tired. She nodded and returned to her book, unaware that the man standing in front of her no longer trusted a single word she'd ever said. James didn't sleep that night. He lay on his side of the bed, staring at the ceiling fan spinning slowly above them. Lillian breathed softly beside him, curled under the covers like she had every night for 15 years. But to James, she wasn't the same person anymore. Her skin didn't feel familiar. Her voice felt rehearsed. Her body, her habits, her eyes. All of it felt like a stranger wearing his wife's face. Over the next several days, James moved like a man with a shadow over his shoulder. He went to work at the garage as usual, greeted customers and handled repairs, but he was distracted. The sound of a socket wrench against a bolt echoed longer. The smell of grease, once comforting, now made him nauseous. At home, Lillian didn't seem to notice his change in behavior, or if she did, she chalked it up to reunion fatigue. But James was watching her now. Not lovingly, not protectively. Suspiciously. He began to catalog everything. The way she locked the bathroom door, even when showering alone. The hesitation when she changed clothes, always facing away from him. Her uncanny avoidance of touch, particularly near her lower abdomen. Her reaction whenever the topic of gender or identity came up on TV. Her body would stiffen, her eyes dart briefly, then she'd get up to make tea or change the subject. He started snooping. One morning, while Lillian was at the library for a volunteer event, James grabbed a screwdriver and carefully jimmied open the desk drawer she always kept locked. Inside, he found a brown leather pouch filled with old letters and some faded photographs. His hands trembled as he sifted through them. One photo stopped him cold. It was a black and white snapshot, clearly from the early 2000s. A young man stood in front of a car garage in Illinois, arms folded. Short hair. No makeup. A jawline identical to Lillian's. On the back of the photo, written in neat penmanship, it said, Leonard M. Monroe Tires, December 2004. James felt like the floor had vanished beneath him. He checked the rest of the letters. Some were from a therapist's office in Bangkok, dated 2006. One envelope contained a folded pamphlet titled, Gender Affirmation Surgery and Your Journey Forward. He sat on the bed, the photo clenched in his fist. It wasn't a theory anymore. It was truth. His wife, the woman he'd kissed, lived with, loved for 15 years, had been born a man. James didn't confront her that night, or the next. He couldn't. He oscillated between rage and confusion, heartbreak and humiliation. He felt lied to, betrayed, violated. He started drinking more, stopping at the bar after work instead of coming home directly. He stared at strangers and wondered if they could tell. Did people know? Had someone figured it out years ago and just never told him? He began avoiding intimacy altogether. When Lillian leaned in for a kiss, he pulled back. When she touched his arm during dinner, he flinched. He started locking his phone, checking her browser history, and reading old documents in the attic while she was asleep. The paranoia consumed him. He couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't breathe without thinking about it. What did this make him? Had the past 15 years been a lie? Was his entire life, his marriage, his memories, built on a false identity? And yet, some nights, some tragic, confused nights, he missed her. He missed the Lillian he thought he knew. Her voice humming in the kitchen. The way she cried during animal rescue ads. The banana bread she baked every Thanksgiving. He wanted to hate her, but he couldn't stop loving her. And that contradiction was what finally broke him. James owned a .38 revolver. He kept it locked in a red toolbox in the shed behind the house. More for nostalgia than protection. His late father had given it to him after returning from Vietnam. He hadn't fired it in years. One cold morning before sunrise, he opened the shed and retrieved the revolver. He loaded it slowly, each bullet sliding in with a final sounding click. He stared at the weapon for a long time. Then he locked it away again. That time. But the line between his thoughts and actions was beginning to blur. The man who had once trusted so blindly, so deeply, was now standing on the edge of something dark. Something irreversible. He wasn't ready to jump. Not yet. But the fall had begun. The house was unusually quiet that night. Dinner had been a silent affair. James picking at his food while Lillian sipped her wine, occasionally glancing at him with concern. She knew something was wrong. The man across the table wasn't the James she'd lived with for 15 years. His eyes didn't soften when he looked at her anymore. His hands, once warm and reassuring, now seemed restless, clenching and unclenching like he was holding onto something invisible. She finally spoke. James, have I done something wrong? He looked up, and for a second he wanted to lie. He wanted to bury it all and pretend he hadn't seen the photograph, the letters, the pamphlet. Pretend the last 2 weeks of mental collapse hadn't happened. But he couldn't. Not anymore. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, and whispered, "Who is Leonard Monroe?" The silence that followed was thunderous. Lillian froze. Her fingers tightened around her wine glass. Her breath caught in her throat. For a moment, James thought she might deny it, say it was someone else, a coincidence, a misunderstanding. But she didn't. She slowly placed the glass down, her face pale, lips pressed into a thin line. And then she said it. He was me. Lillian didn't cry. She didn't beg. She didn't run. She sat back in her chair, folded her hands, and met his gaze. Calm, heavy, brave. My name was Leonard Monroe, she said. I transitioned 18 years ago. Fully. I moved to a new state, changed my name, started over. You were the first person who saw me as I always wanted to be seen. Not a man pretending, but a woman living. James stared at her like she was a ghost. You married me, slept next to me, told me you loved me. And all this time, I do love you, she interrupted. More than I've ever loved anyone. That part was never a lie. He shot up from the table, the chair scraping violently against the floor. But you are a lie, he hissed. No, she said, standing too. I'm not. I'm your wife. I've lived every day of this marriage as myself. I never wanted to hurt you. You tricked me, James said, his voice rising. 15 years, Lillian. 15. You let me believe you were someone else. She stepped toward him. You fell in love with who I am, not what I was. James recoiled, like she was something diseased. You're not a woman. Her face broke, finally. That was the blow that landed. She blinked away the sting, but the words dug deep. I am, she said quietly. Whether you can accept that or not. James stormed out of the house. He didn't take the truck. He just walked. Down the empty street, past the dead streetlights, into the nearby park where the wind howled through the trees like a warning. He sat on a bench, his fists clenched in his lap, his jaw twitching. Everything felt wrong. His love, his past, his identity. What did that make him? Had he been used? Had he been sleeping next to a man? The shame burned in his chest like acid. But beneath it all, underneath the rage and confusion and wounded pride, there was something else. Something quieter. Grief. He was grieving the person he thought he knew. The life he thought he had. When he returned home hours later, Lillian was sitting on the couch, waiting. She stood as he entered, eyes red from crying. Please, she whispered. Talk to me. He said nothing. Walked past her. Went upstairs. That night, they didn't sleep in the same bed. And something inside him, something dangerous, was beginning to harden. The next day, James made a call. To a man he hadn't spoken to in years. His cousin, Brian. A local deputy. Got something you need to look into, James said calmly, holding the phone tight. I think my wife forged her documents. Might be living under a false identity. Brian paused. What are you saying, James? I think she's hiding something criminal. Something big. I need to know what I'm dealing with. The call ended with a promise. I'll look into it. Keep this quiet. James hung up. It wasn't about justice. It was about revenge. If he couldn't make peace with the truth, he'd find a way to erase it. It had been 4 days since the confrontation. Lillian and James moved around the house like ghosts. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, the kind that hung in the silence longer than any shouted argument ever could. James hadn't said a single loving thing to her since the night she told him the truth. He barely acknowledged her presence. At breakfast, he stared at the wall. At dinner, he ate in silence, pushing food around his plate like a man pretending to be okay. But he wasn't okay. He was unraveling. And no one, not even Lillian, could see just how far gone he was. On the 5th day, James received a call from his cousin Brian. Hey, Brian said, voice low and cautious. You weren't wrong. Her name really was Leonard Monroe. Changed her identity legally, overseas. Nothing criminal per se. But yeah, it's all real. James didn't respond at first. Brian hesitated, then added, I also found the missing persons report, filed by Leonard's parents in 2007. They thought he was dead. Disowned him after they found out about the transition. Never followed up after that. Why didn't anyone come looking? James asked, his voice dry. Guess they didn't want to, Brian said. Or didn't care enough. That hit James in a strange place. He hung up, staring at the phone. His wife had been abandoned by her own family, disappeared into a new life, rebuilt herself, and somehow, he had been the one she trusted enough to love. He could have taken that realization as a path to healing. Instead, he saw it as betrayal stacked upon betrayal. She had nothing before him, and now she had everything because of him. And in James's deteriorating mind, that meant she had taken everything from him. That night, after Lillian went to bed, James walked to the shed and took out the revolver he'd hidden. He loaded it slowly, something inside him unraveling. He got in his truck and drove aimlessly, stewing in betrayal and rage after discovering Lillian had been born male, a truth she'd never shared during their 15-year marriage. By morning, he returned home. Lillian, unaware of what was coming, offered to leave to give them space. But James, cold and broken, pulled out the gun and shot her 7 times. He called 911 calmly. "My wife's dead. I shot her." Police arrived. James surrendered without a fight. In court, he remained silent. His lawyers claimed emotional trauma. The prosecution called it murder. After 2 days, the jury found him guilty of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 45 years. Lillian was buried under her chosen name. No biological family attended, only friends and members of the LGBTQ+ community. A plaque by her grave reads, "She lived her truth. She died for it." James now sits in prison, alone and forgotten. Another life lost to secrets, shame, and silence.